Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This is Tableau Paint by Numbers, and we're going to be talking about doing some analysis related to longitudinal giving. My name is Glenn Kendall, and also with me today is Holly Kendall.
Hello everyone.
So for GoToWebinar, what you're going to want to do is pop out the part of the control panel there for questions. So you can click on the little button next to that and pop it out so that you can ask us questions during the webinar. We'll just go ahead and take questions as they come. And then hit that little red arrow up at the top of the control panel, which will collapse the rest of it back down again. So that way you can see everything that we're doing, but at the same time, you know, when a question comes up, you go ahead and ask your question in there, and we will talk about it. The tools that we're going to be using today, we're going to be using Tableau Desktop primarily. We're on version 10.3. We're going to be connecting to Tableau Server, where our data we're going to be using for the webinar lives. We're going to be using a data source that we created called the GIF data source, which is based on RE query. So this is something that we do as part of our Tableau service here at Concourse, that if you get Tableau with us, basically we take your Razor's Edge data and build different data sources out of it. And those data sources mirror how RE query works. So that'll make a little more sense once we get into it. But what you can do is you can take those same data fields that we're going to be working with and just do an export out of Razor's Edge based on that, and then be able to manipulate your data from there. This webinar is being recorded, so we will go ahead and, you know, send you a link to have a copy of it after we're done, so you can watch it more later. So when we're talking about longitudinal analysis, this is kind of a research term, and so this is just whatever. If you type in longitudinal study or longitudinal analysis in Google, this is what pops up. It's basically, you know, it's a research method. It's usually associated with like studying animals or studying health-related things. And so you're gathering data on the same subjects over a period of time, right? So that's what a longitudinal study is. So my question to you is, if we're talking about fundraising data, what are some of the things that we can use to define what we call subjects in the fundraising world when we're tracking donors and gifts? So I'm going to give you guys a minute or two here to go ahead and in that question area, this will be kind of, you know, the interactive part right off the bat, where just put some ideas as to what you think, what would be a good subject to look at. Also maybe a segment. Don't be bashful. Go ahead and type something in. I know you attended this webinar because you're something you know, got your interest, drew your interest as far as what these might be. So just type into the question there section, what are some different subjects or segments that you currently look at when you're doing your own analysis. So one might be, right, demographic related information, something maybe related to age, Any other ideas for segments or subjects? A very bashful group today. Well, if you're a university, you naturally think of classes, right? So you have graduating classes of certain years. So those alumni classes would be another set of subjects. What else? What's another subject that you might look at with your fundraising data? Maybe something related to appeals that you sent, or a group of appeals, maybe a campaign. Okay. Today, specifically, we're going to look at what I call a giving cohort. And we're going to define the cohort as based on the year the donor first donated to your organization, when they first became engaged. That first donation came in, that year, that fiscal year that happened, they're going to be in a cohort. And I think it's interesting to look at this because it's behavior-based. And that's something, when you're doing the longitudinal studies anyway, you do an observation, you do an observation, you do an observation. But then like something happens in there that's an event that you record that's interesting. So in this case, it's behavior-based. They made a donation. Other segments that you might look at are not necessarily behavior-based. It's based on an assumption. If it's the class of 2010, so that's a segment that you may look at, a cohort that you may look at, and you may be sending appeals to them, but you only have a certain percentage of them that might actually be engaged and participating. By looking at the giving cohort, these are people who actually participated, who actually made a donation, regardless of if they were part of that class or responded to that certain appeal or whatever. And I think also by looking at it over the course of a year, anyone who gave during the course of a year is more holistic. Things that are just on an appeal basis are fine and interesting as well, but they might be too targeted or too narrow. If you think of it, over the course of a year, there's all sorts of things that went into how your organization was presenting itself, your website, your donation page, your brand, the look and feel of things, just your messaging. All these kinds of things went into what inspired somebody to make a donation in a given year. So I think in that way, it's more interesting to look at cohorts in this way. So that's what we're going to do in today's webinar, is look at it, giving cohorts by year. All right. So again, I'm using Tableau Desktop. You don't have to use Tableau Desktop. You can use, well, a version of Tableau Desktop called Tableau Public if you don't have a license, but you can, get a free trial of Tableau Desktop. I'll just ask another question real quick here before I get started. How many people are using Tableau Desktop, or and then if so, like how much experience do you have with Tableau? Are you new to Tableau? Have you been using it for a while? Just type into the question area there, like how much experience you have using Tableau. Okay, it looks like some people are new. Some people have been using it for almost a year. New. So it looks like relatively new. Okay, great. Thank you for your responses there. So the first thing I'm going to do is connect to my data. So again, I'm going to be connecting to our Tableau server. I'm just connecting to sample data. So this is just the Razor's Edge sample database. We've added some additional GIFs and whatnot in there as well to make it, you know, a little more recent and a little more interesting. But it's basically the Razor's Edge sample database. This is the data source now that we created within our Tableau server. So this is again a feature that we have of our service, where we've made this data source, this GIFs data source, that mirrors how Razor's Edge query works. So these are the same fields you would have in Razor's Edge query. And the reason we do this is so that you can easily, you know, have queries you already know and love. If you want to be able to use them in Tableau, it's much easier to do the translation. So, you know, stuff that you might start with right away for just looking at GIFs over time is you just look at, you know, just doing something really simple like the gift date and the gift amount. And you pull those in there and you have a graph like this. It just says, hey, here's how much money that we got. Here's all the gifts we've ever received by year. So the interesting thing now is that, okay, now let's look at it by what we talked about earlier, by cohort, to say, okay, how many of these gifts came in by the cohort that we're interested in? So we have to create a calculated field to define that cohort. So up here in Tableau, you can just say create calculated field. I'm going to do that. I'm just going to call it cohort. And I'm going to use a kind of an advanced function in Tableau, but one that if you are using Razor's Edge or GIF data, you're going to have to get accustomed to, and that's the level of detail. So what the level of detail does is it lets you look at all the records within for a given constituent, say in this case, and then find something specific, find some specific detail within there. So fixed means I'm looking at, you know, what is it that I'm going to look at? So in this case, I'm going to be looking at a constituent record. So we just happen to call it the record internal ID. You know it as the records ID in Razor's Edge. That's basically the unique ID that associates them with the constituent. Then I do a colon, and then what I'm going to look for is the minimum gift date. So for a given constituent, using the records ID, that constituent can have many gifts. And so we're going to look for the minimum gift date, so basically the first time they gave. And that's what this is doing. It's doing it across all the records in there. So that's basically what the level of detail does. Okay, does that make sense? Any questions about the level of detail? So this is giving us every, you know, just the date, the first date that they gave. To make a cohort out of it, now we want to do that as part of a year. So we're going to look at just the year of that. So there's a function called datepart. So I'm going to do datepart of year. And then say, okay, I'm going to look at just the year part of when they gave. And then since we're doing a lot of times people do fiscal years, I'm just going to put a string in here and call it fiscal year, and then convert this other part into a string. So this field that I'm creating is a string. It's a dimension. and it's just got the letters FY in front of it with a space, and then I'm converting the rest of this into a string. Cool. So that's my cohort. So one thing you might be tempted to do right away is to just say, okay, let's throw this on maybe a color. And so then we can see, okay, here's our different cohorts. So these are the cohorts are, again, the year they first gave. So here's all the different cohorts that we have. And then you can see, okay, in 2008, people who actually were first-time donors in 2008, they're this color. People that were of the cohort of they gave the previous year are of this color, and so on. So we can see, okay, there's a breakdown, different years, all of that. But over here it gets crazy. Looking at all these different colors, I mean, this is messy. This is definitely not a good way to analyze the data. It's just too much information in there and not enough detail for us to be able to look at. So we're going to get rid of that. And instead, we're going to look at it by cohort against year. And now we're going to put the gift amount in there. All right, so this gives us a little bit more of what we're looking for. So in this case, we have for a given cohort, say this cohort here, fiscal year 2009, they gave this much in 2009, then here's how much they gave subsequent years. So it really fell off. And then in this year, 2017, this cohort who first gave to us in 2009 gave a lot more money. See that? To make this a little bit easier to see, we can change it into a highlight table. In a highlight table, you can do that in Tableau by just hitting the Show Me up here, and then the highlight table's in the upper right. Okay. So the numbers themselves, you know, are interesting, but I think it's we're more interested in relative to each other. What does it mean? So instead of just looking at the raw numbers, what we can do is look at it as a percentage. So I'm going to do a quick table calculation and look at it as the percent of the total instead of just the raw numbers. So now when we look at it, we can see, aha, this cohort here, of all the money this cohort has ever given us, 48% of that money came the first year, then really tailed off, and then we got a big engagement again later on. What I'm actually going to do here is reverse these, and then add some totals. I like looking at totals on the bottom. It just makes sense to me to, you know, look at it and have it total down. So there's a couple of different ways we can look at this. One is by the cohort themselves, and the other is by the year. So we'll start with the cohort, and that is to say, for a given cohort, what is the cohort giving across all the fiscal years? So the top is the cohort, and then here's all the different fiscal years. So this is what we're seeing. Okay, does that make sense? Is there any questions about this part? I'm going to do a little bit of formatting here. I am going to make this bigger. bolder. Maybe change the color up. Change the color so that it's a little brighter to look at. Put some lines in here. Format things out a little bit. It's always a good idea to throw some filters in as well. One thing you should start with is the gift type. So you might want to remove pledges. So you're just looking at cash, or at least give your user that option. So if we show the filter, I'm going to make it be multi-value dropdown. This allows the user to change and look at which gift types they want to see within this. Another thing that we have from a previous webinar is this dimension called giving level. So this is basically your giving pyramids in factors of 10. This would be interesting to look at for just being able to filter out maybe certain giving levels. So for example, here we say, okay, this cohort that we were talking about earlier, the 2009 cohort that had another big engagement here in 2017. I wonder if that was all because of maybe just one major gift. So if we were to filter that out, would that change things? And yes, in fact, it did change things quite a bit. And so by doing that, you can, use this as a way to look at your different giving levels and then say, okay, that might help separate out, annual giving versus major giving, corporate giving, that kind of stuff, just based on the giving level. Give you some more information there. We'll just leave this all for now. And then finally, just to filter on the cohort itself. And we don't want to filter on the year on this one, because what we're doing in this case is we're looking at all the years that a cohort gave. But it may be interesting just to grab certain cohorts and look at them together. Let's say I just want to look at these 4 cohorts. Then my filter lets me do that. Again, if you show the filter, let your user make that choice and be able to interact with the viz and do it. So then you can make a comparison to see, how these cohorts compare to each other, right? I'll go ahead and rename this sheet here. This will be cohort giving. Let's say across fiscal years. Format this. Okay. Any questions before we move on to another way to slice this. So hopefully this is making sense as far as the cohorts go. And again, we're recording this. You can watch it again to get the calculated field that we're using, and we will also send out the cheat sheet that has this calculation in it so that you can make your own cohort calculation in your visualizations. All right, so I'm going to duplicate this now. So now, instead of looking at cohort giving by fiscal years, let's look at fiscal year giving by cohort. Let's flip it around. We can do that by literally flipping around the viz. You can hit this button up here that says swap rows and columns. So this will put now the date on the top and the cohort on the left. In order to keep the totals right, it moved these things over. But what I really need to do is to change my table calculations. So before I was going down, and in order to remain consistent, it switched it to across, but I want it to go down again now, as we're doing across cohorts by, for each fiscal year. So I can either say down, or I can say, choose cohort in here instead, whatever's easier. Instead of the totals, I want to do column grand totals again. So in this case, it doesn't make sense to filter by, I want to get rid of the other totals. I don't want row, I just want the column. So it doesn't make sense now to filter by cohort anymore. So we're going to get rid of that. We want to instead filter by date. And we'll do a range of dates. Since we're talking years, we'll do relative dates actually. We'll just say however many, whatever, 10 years. And then you can show this filter. And it would allow the user to be able to change this. You can bump it up to whatever. I mean, the nice thing about the way that we're doing this here is that we're connecting to Tableau server. This is an extract. So you can either connect to a live data source or an extract. We're doing an extract, so it's literally pulled all of the data out of Razor's Edge. Granted, it's just the sample database, so it's not that much. But when you work with, if you have a lot of data and you want to do a big analysis like this across all of your data, when you can do it in the form of an extract, it's going to be super fast. It's like 100 times faster than doing it against the live data source. Okay. So now we're just looking at it a little bit differently. So we say for a given fiscal year, how much data, or how much money came in for a given cohort. So that's to be expected in 2005. Well, I don't know if it's to be expected, but all the money came in from just 2005. 2006, we got a big engagement still from the 2005 people, not as many from 2006. And then, you can just break it down here. And then here's our 2009 people gave a lot of money. We didn't get so much from the previous people. And then, yeah, I think this is just really interesting to look at. Again, because this is just sample data, things aren't going to necessarily pop out. But when you're looking at your own data, some of the things you want to look at are people getting more engaged? Are they giving bigger and bigger gifts later on? So for example, at a university, you might expect the alumni of a recently graduated class may give a gift, but that gift likely isn't going to be very big because they're poor, they just graduated, they have student loan debts, whatever. They're not going to give that much money. But later on, over time, as they become established in their careers, they get more money, they'll have, you know, greater engagement, greater giving that will happen over time. So you can see watch that and see with the cohorts to see, okay, you know, there's going to be giving at a certain level, but then, you know, hopefully you would see that giving ramp up at least for a certain segment of those over time. And then doing it this way too, you can look and see, you know, it's like, what were we doing in 2009 that we were able to get this high engagement of people? What were we doing in 2010, you know, that didn't work so well? That kind of thing. Okay, that's really the main stuff that I had for you today. I'm just going to rename this sheet. We're going to call this Fiscal Giving. Fiscal Year Giving. Across cohorts. If any of you have Tableau with us, we will be publishing these workbooks to your Tableau site, so you'll get them automatically. And yeah, I will take any questions anybody has here. I'll leave it open for a minute or so for questions. And otherwise, thank you all for joining today. I really appreciate it. All right, doesn't look like there's any questions. I'm going to stick around for another couple minutes. If you do have a question, go ahead and I'll be here to ask it. But otherwise, thanks again for joining, and have a great day.